November 2nd, 1944. The rain came down in sheets, seeping into uniforms and soaking through boots as American infantry advanced toward the German frontier. Before them loomed the Hürtgen Forest, a vast expanse of towering firs and tangled undergrowth stretching across 50 square miles. Cloaked in heavy fog, the woods seemed to swallow light itself. Visibility fell to a few yards, and the men who entered described it as stepping into a cathedral of shadows. For the soldiers of the U.S. 9th Infantry Division, the first to push into the forest, the war suddenly felt different. The rolling fields of France and Belgium were gone. Here, every tree became a fortress, every ridge a trap. Artillery shells whistled overhead and detonated among the branches, raining down wooden splinters as deadly as shrapnel. Survivors later recalled how the sound of exploding shells was followed by a second storm. The crack and hiss of shattered wood cascading through the darkness. The men quickly realized this was not just another battle. It was a place where the forest itself seemed to fight them. A soldier later wrote in his diary that the trees were as dangerous as the Germans. You could not hide, you could not run, and you never knew where death would come from. As the Americans dug into shallow foxholes, rain turned the ground into a mire of mud. Rifles clogged with dirt, boots grew heavier with every step, and rations spoiled in the damp. The fog hung so thick that men sometimes stumbled into their own lines or fired at shadows, convinced the enemy was closer than he was. In this environment, nerves frayed quickly. The enemy could be 10 yards away, and you would never know until the muzzle flash lit the trees. Opposite them, German defenders knew every inch of the terrain. Under the command of seasoned officers, they had fortified the forest with bunkers, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire. The Siegfried Line, Germany's great western wall of pillboxes and dragon's teeth, lay just beyond, but the Hürtgen itself became a natural barrier. German machine gunners and mortarmen used the forest cover to devastating effect, vanishing into the trees after each strike. For them, the terrain was an ally. For the Americans, it was a labyrinth of death. The first clashes were sharp and unforgiving. Patrols moved cautiously along narrow logging trails, often ambushed by German troops concealed behind fallen logs or dug deep into camouflaged bunkers. Casualties mounted rapidly, not only from enemy fire but from the relentless artillery that shattered morale as much as it shattered bodies. A platoon could lose half its men in a single barrage, leaving survivors stunned and disoriented in the smoking wreckage. The forest gave no relief. Supplies lagged far behind. Wounded men were dragged through mud on improvised stretchers, many dying before they reached aid stations. Evacuation was nearly impossible. Jeeps bogged down on sodden trails, and medics struggled to carry the injured through miles of dense timber. In this bleak environment, soldiers learned to expect little more than exhaustion, fear, and loss. And yet, the orders were clear: advance. The Allies had broken across France, liberated Paris, and stood at Germany's doorstep. Commanders believed the Hürtgen had to be secured to protect the southern flank of the drive toward the Rhine. For the men in the foxholes, however, the mission seemed less about strategy and more about survival. The battle they had entered would not last days or weeks, but months. From November 1944 into February 1945, division after division would be fed into the forest, only to be consumed by its merciless defenses. Historians later called it a green hell and the battle that should never have been fought. But on that cold November morning, none of that was known. The soldiers only understood that the forest was closing around them, and that retreat was not an option. The stage was set for the longest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army in World War II. What began as a step into the mist would become an ordeal of unimaginable suffering, a nightmare of mud, steel, and blood, from which few would emerge unscathed. As the artillery rumbled and the fog pressed close, one question lingered over every man who shouldered his rifle and stepped deeper into the woods. Why here, and why now? The answer lay not in the forest itself, but in the strategic gamble that had drawn them into it. The first blood spilled in the Hürtgen Forest demanded an answer. Why were American soldiers ordered into such a place at all? To understand the battle, one had to pull back from the fog-shrouded ridges and look to the grand strategy of autumn 1944. The Allies had broken out of Normandy in July, liberated Paris in August, and by September were pressing at the very doorstep of Germany. Optimism coursed through the ranks. Many believed the war could be over by Christmas. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower envisioned a broad-front advance into the heart of the Reich, overwhelming the German defenses before they could regroup. General Omar Bradley, leading the U.S. 12th Army Group, directed his forces toward the German borderlands, intent on breaching the Siegfried Line, the West Wall as the Germans called it. The Hurtgen lay directly in their path. This dense forest, stretching along the Belgian-German frontier south of Aachen, concealed the formidable fortifications of the Siegfried Line. Concrete bunkers, camouflaged pillboxes, belts of barbed wire, and minefields threaded through the undergrowth. For German Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, the forest was a natural ally. He understood that in such terrain, Allied artillery and air power, the tools that had shattered German positions across France, would lose their dominance. In the Hurtgen, men would fight at close quarters, where German skill and defense could exact a terrible price. But the forest itself was not the only concern. To the south lay the Rur River dams. If German forces retained control of these massive structures, they could unleash catastrophic floods across the valleys, drowning Allied advances into the Rhineland and stalling momentum for weeks. For American planners, the dams became an obsession. Securing them meant securing the path to the Rhine. And so, step by step, the U.S. First Army was drawn into the Hurtgen, convinced that the forest had to be cleared before the next great push. The gamble, however, underestimated the enemy's resolve. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht was battered but not broken. The German High Command knew the Reich itself was at stake. Units were withdrawn from collapsing fronts and redeployed to the west. Model ordered his divisions to fight for every tree, every hill, and every trail. Young Volksgrenadiers, seasoned infantry, and paratroopers dug in with fanatical determination. The forest, with its natural choke points and limited visibility, turned small groups of defenders into formidable obstacles. American commanders, relying on maps that gave little sense of the terrain, believed the operation would take only days. Instead, it stretched into weeks and then months. The forest was supposed to be an obstacle, not a battlefield, one officer later reflected. But once we entered, it consumed us. The broader context of the Western Front only deepened the urgency. To the north, Field Marshal Montgomery pressed his forces toward the Ruhr industrial heartland. To the south, Patton's Third Army strained for crossings over the Moselle. Eisenhower insisted that momentum be maintained on all fronts. Bradley and his generals, eager to keep pace, ordered repeated thrusts into the Hurtgen, convinced it was the logical next step toward the Rhine. Yet the logic proved fatally flawed. Terrain, weather, and German preparation created a trap. Every mile gained cost blood. Tanks bogged down in mud or were shredded by mines. Artillery shells burst in the treetops, turning pine branches into lances. And still the orders came. Advance, secure the forest, take the dams. The Hurtgen thus became more than a tactical operation. It was the embodiment of strategic ambition colliding with brutal reality. Eisenhower and Bradley sought speed, a relentless drive to finish the war. Model and his commanders sought delay, bleeding the Allies to buy time for a counteroffensive. Both aims converged in the forest, where soldiers fought not only each other, but also the elements themselves. As November deepened, the cost in men grew staggering, and still no breakthrough was achieved. The Hurtgen was already earning its reputation as a place where optimism went to die. And yet, American divisions continued to be fed into its shadowed depths, one after another. The nightmare had only begun. The decision to clear the Hurtgen Forest soon fell upon the U.S. 9th Infantry Division, veterans of North Africa and Sicily. Hardened men, they had fought across 2 continents. Yet nothing in their experience prepared them for the green labyrinth of Germany's frontier. On November 5, 1944, their regiments moved forward into the thick woods and stepped directly into a nightmare. Rain fell without mercy. The forest floor turned to black mud, clinging to boots and bogging down vehicles. Pine needles dripped with cold mist, and visibility shrank to a handful of yards. Soldiers could barely see the man ahead of them, much less the enemy. Every movement was slowed, every sound amplified, and always, above the canopy, the dull rumble of German artillery waiting to strike. The first shells shattered through the treetops. Unlike in open fields, where shrapnel fanned outward, here the tall pines turned each burst into a storm of splinters. Fragments of wood and steel slashed through ranks, wounding men before they had even glimpsed the enemy. Survivors later called it tree burst hell, a sound and sight that haunted them for decades. One soldier wrote simply, "The forest itself was killing us." Progress was measured in yards. The 9th Division advanced down narrow trails mined with S-mines and booby traps. Engineers worked frantically, probing with bayonets, but the Germans had sown the ground with ruthless precision. Every cleared path soon became another kill zone. Patrols vanished into the fog and never returned. Behind the lines, medical stations filled beyond capacity. Stretchers lined the mud, wounded men lying under ponchos as medics tried desperately to keep them alive. But evacuation was nearly impossible. The same mines, mud, and artillery that trapped the infantry also trapped their casualties. Some men lay in the forest for days before help reached them. In diaries, soldiers recalled hearing cries for water and morphine echo through the trees at night, voices that gradually faded into silence. After a week, the 9th Infantry Division had been ground down to exhaustion. Companies that entered the forest at full strength returned with barely half their numbers. Still, higher command pressed for more. By mid-November, the 28th Infantry Division was thrown into the fight. Fresh troops, many newly arrived from the States, now faced the same ordeal. The 28th's baptism of fire was brutal. Marching in their distinctive red keystone insignia, they carried optimism into the woods. But within days, that optimism dissolved. Rain turned into sleet. Foxholes filled with water. Men huddled under thin ponchos, shivering, unable to light fires for warmth or food. A young officer later recalled, "We fought the forest as much as we fought the Germans. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere." German paratroopers, Fallschirmjäger, launched sudden ambushes, striking from hidden bunkers and then vanishing into the pines. Snipers waited silently, their shots cracking through the mist. Each step forward demanded blood. Morale plummeted. Letters home revealed the despair. Soldiers described the Hurtgen as a green hell, a place without mercy, and a graveyard of divisions. For many, hope lay only in surviving long enough to be pulled from the line. Yet replacements were constantly sent in, ensuring the cycle continued. New faces joining the foxholes, only to be swallowed by the forest days later. By the end of November, both the 9th and 28th Divisions were shattered. Casualty lists mounted into the thousands, and still no clear front line existed. The forest blurred the distinction between offense and defense. Each ridge, each clearing, had to be fought for again and again. One sergeant summed it up bitterly, "We weren't capturing ground. We were feeding the forest." The Hurtgen consumed men and morale alike, grinding entire divisions into shadows of their former strength. Yet higher command, fixated on the Rur River dams and the push toward the Rhine, demanded the battle continue. The forest was not finished with the U.S. Army, and the worst was yet to come. By late November 1944, the Hurtgen campaign had ceased to resemble a battle of maneuver. It had become a slow, grinding contest of endurance, a war of attrition where every yard of earth was paid for with blood. Fresh divisions were fed into the forest. The 4th Infantry Division, veterans of Normandy, was ordered into the labyrinth of pine and mud. The 8th Division soon followed. Each entered with confidence, but within days their optimism dissolved into the same despair that had broken the 9th and 28th before them. Progress was measured not in miles, but in yards. A ridge gained by dusk could be lost by dawn, retaken at noon, and abandoned again by evening. The Germans, under Field Marshal Walter Model, were stretched thin. Supplies dwindled, replacements were scarce, and their lines were under constant strain. Yet the forest favored the defender. Concrete bunkers, remnants of the old Siegfried Line, lay hidden in the undergrowth. Minefields and barbed wire blocked approaches. The enemy clung stubbornly to each ridge, fighting with the grim resolve of men who knew the forest was their shield. For the Americans, misery deepened as the winter closed in. Bitter cold swept across the Hurtgen. Snow fell through the canopy, mixing with rain to create a perpetual chill. Soldiers dug foxholes only to see them fill with icy water. Men slept sitting upright, rifles across their knees, their feet numb and swollen from frostbite. Hypothermia claimed lives as surely as German bullets. One officer later recalled, "We lost men who never heard a shot fired, frozen stiff in their foxholes." The dense canopy blocked sunlight, making time itself blur. Soldiers wrote of losing the ability to tell day from night. The forest floor was cloaked in perpetual twilight, broken only by the flash of artillery and the hiss of falling shells. Between bombardments, an eerie silence reigned, a silence so complete that men could hear the drip of melted snow from the branches above. It was a silence that bred fear, for it meant the next German attack could come at any moment. Psychological strain bore down on the troops. Men cracked under the pressure, their nerves shattered by days of unending shell fire. Medics recorded growing numbers of psychiatric casualties, soldiers trembling uncontrollably, unable to speak, unable to fight. In diaries, survivors described comrades wandering aimlessly through the woods, eyes vacant, whispering prayers to themselves. The Hurtgen was consuming not just bodies but minds. Despite the carnage, commanders continued to press forward. Each division was ordered to seize a hill, a road junction, or a ridge, objectives that on a map seemed small, but in reality demanded staggering sacrifice. Entire battalions were reduced to skeletons in the effort. By December, the U.S. Army had suffered more than 24,000 casualties in the Hurtgen. For the Germans, too, the cost was immense. Their own divisions bled heavily, cut down by American artillery and airstrikes that managed to penetrate the canopy. Yet the defenders clung to the forest with an almost fatalistic determination. To them, every day of resistance was a day bought for Germany's crumbling Western Front. The Hurtgen was no longer about territory. It had become a test of willpower, a grim contest to see which army could endure the misery longer. For the men on the ground, it was a living nightmare. As one infantryman wrote after weeks in the line, "The trees never end. The fire never stops. The forest has no bottom, only graves." By the time December approached, both sides were exhausted. Yet the forest still demanded more blood, and the Americans had not reached the dams that had first drawn them into this hell. The Hurtgen campaign was far from over, and worse trials still lay ahead. As the fighting dragged on in the Hurtgen through late November and early December, another storm was gathering just miles to the south. The battered divisions clawing through the pines did not know it, but Adolf Hitler was preparing his last great gamble of the war, a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes. The Allied High Command had become fixated on the Hurtgen. Eisenhower, Bradley, and Hodges believed the forest and its Rur River dams had to be secured before advancing toward the Rhine. Divisions bled themselves dry in the pines, replacements were rushed in, and artillery ammunition was consumed at a staggering rate. By the first week of December 1944, more than 24,000 American casualties had been recorded in the Hurtgen campaign alone. Exhausted battalions were pulled from the line not for rest, but to be sent elsewhere, to defend what was believed to be the quiet sector of the Ardennes. It was anything but quiet. At dawn on December 16, 1944, the German army unleashed Operation Walk am Rhein. More than 200,000 men, supported by panzers, artillery, and aircraft, poured through the snow-covered Ardennes. Their aim was audacious: to split the Allied front, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. For many American units, the timing was catastrophic. Veterans of the Hurtgen, barely recovered from weeks in the forest, suddenly found themselves hurled into another desperate struggle. The 28th Infantry Division, shattered in the pines only weeks before, now stood directly in the path of the German advance. Men who had fought over a single ridge in the Hurtgen were now ordered to hold entire towns against armored columns. Eyewitness accounts spoke of disbelief. One infantryman later wrote, "We thought nothing could be worse than Hurtgen. Then the Bulge came, and we realized our nightmare had only shifted." The diversion of resources to the Hurtgen weighed heavily on Allied readiness. Artillery stocks were depleted, divisions were worn thin, and commanders underestimated the Ardennes sector, believing it too rugged for a German offensive. Historians would later debate whether the obsession with the forest blinded Allied command at the worst possible moment. Had those men and supplies been conserved, the opening blows of the Bulge might have been blunted more easily. Yet the connection between the two battles was more than logistical. For soldiers on the ground, it was deeply personal. The forest had chewed up their strength, and when the Ardennes exploded, many felt abandoned by their leaders. Survivors recalled the bitterness of realizing that their sacrifices in the Hurtgen had gained little strategic advantage. The Rur River dams, the supposed prize of the campaign, still remained in German hands. Meanwhile, German commanders exploited the overlap. Field Marshal Walter Model, who had orchestrated the Hurtgen defense, fed reports back to Berlin that the Americans were bogged down and bleeding. Hitler took heart, convinced that his Ardennes offensive could succeed. For the GIs, the sense of déjà vu was overwhelming. Another forest, another winter, another fight against an enemy that refused to yield. But this time, the stakes stretched across the entire Western Front. The Hurtgen had been America's nightmare. The Ardennes would become a test of survival for the Allied advance into Germany. The link between the two battles was undeniable. The Forest campaign had drained divisions, diverted attention, and set the stage for disaster. Now, as German tanks rolled through the snow and villages burned in the Ardennes, American soldiers carried the scars of Hurtgen with them into the Bulge. The nightmare was not over, it was only spreading. By February 1945, the nightmare of the Hurtgen had at last drawn to a close. American forces, reinforced and restructured after months of unrelenting combat, had finally clawed their way through the dense, corpse-strewn forest. The trees that had once shielded German bunkers now stood shattered, their blackened trunks testifying to a battle fought inch by inch. Yet as the smoke cleared, victory felt hollow. The cost was staggering. Nearly 33,000 American casualties had been recorded, a tally that included the dead, the wounded, and the missing. Thousands more had been lost not to bullets or shrapnel, but to trench foot, pneumonia, frostbite, and sheer exhaustion. The forest had killed as efficiently as the enemy. German casualties, while also severe, were strategically less consequential. Their mission had been to delay, and in that grim aim, they had succeeded. For the men who survived, the victory was bitter. In foxholes and field hospitals, soldiers wrote of their disillusionment. One infantryman reflected in his diary that the forest took everything from us and gave nothing back. Their words echoed the widespread sentiment that the campaign had consumed lives for little gain. The Rur River dams, the original justification for the offensive, were not captured until weeks later, by which time the German front was already collapsing under pressure elsewhere. Tactically, the Allies had achieved little beyond clearing a few miles of woodland. Strategically, the campaign had diverted strength from other offensives, drained divisions, and left thousands of families grieving. Commanders at the highest levels would later admit privately that the Hurtgen operation had been a mistake, a costly diversion that failed to yield proportional rewards. Yet at the time, the inertia of war had carried it forward. Once blood was spilled, momentum and pride demanded more. The landscape itself bore witness to the futility. Fields were strewn with rusted helmets and broken rifles. The forest floor was pitted with shell craters that filled with icy water. Villages at the edge of the Hurtgen lay in ruins, their inhabitants scattered or dead. For weeks after the fighting ended, burial teams combed the undergrowth, retrieving bodies frozen where they had fallen. Psychological wounds ran even deeper. Survivors recalled an inability to distinguish day from night beneath the canopy, where perpetual twilight distorted time. Some confessed to waking in hospitals weeks later, unsure how they had left the battlefield. Medical officers noted a surge in cases of combat fatigue, what would later be called post-traumatic stress. One after-action report observed bluntly, units were ground down not only in strength, but in spirit. For the Germans, the Hurtgen defense came at an enormous price as well. Estimates put their losses between 28,000 and 30,000 men, many of them irreplaceable by 1945. Yet they had accomplished what they set out to do: delay the Allied advance long enough to stage the Ardennes counteroffensive and bleed American divisions until their momentum faltered. In that sense, the Hurtgen campaign was as much a German success as an American victory. As historians would later observe, the Hurtgen was a paradox, won on the battlefield, but lost in the ledger of strategy. The United States Army had proven its resolve and endurance, but at an appalling cost that yielded no decisive breakthrough. When the Americans finally emerged from the trees, they carried not triumph, but bitterness. The forest had swallowed divisions whole, leaving only scarred survivors to tell of it. The Hurtgen campaign remains, to this day, one of the most controversial chapters of the U.S. Army's war in Europe. Its legacy is written not in territory gained, but in the human price paid for ground that, in hindsight, might never have been worth the taking. It was a victory, but a bitter one. The Hürtgen Forest faded from the headlines as the great drama of the Battle of the Bulge seized the world's attention in December 1944. Yet for the men who had endured its suffocating pines and relentless shellfire, the Hürtgen remained the true nightmare of their war. Overshadowed in history, it became a campaign remembered less for triumph than for suffering, less for strategy than for sacrifice. For veterans, the comparisons were stark. Many who had stormed ashore in Normandy or fought through the frozen Ardennes later recalled the Hürtgen as worse than both. Normandy had its beaches, its clear objectives, its sense of momentum. The Bulge, though desperate, carried the weight of turning back Hitler's last gamble. But the Hürtgen? It was remembered as a place where men fought the forest itself, a labyrinth of mud, rain, and death, where each tree could kill and no horizon promised relief. The legacy was written not in victories gained, but in the scars carried home. Survivors spoke of weeks spent in perpetual twilight, the thick canopy blotting out sun and moon alike. Men who had crawled out of foxholes decades earlier still woke in cold sweats, recalling the sound of splintering wood as shells tore the forest apart. One veteran later confessed, "In the Bulge, at least you knew where the enemy was. In the Hürtgen, you never knew if the forest itself was about to fall on you." Strategically, the campaign remains controversial. Historians have long debated whether the forest needed to be taken at all. The Rur River dams, the supposed objective, were not neutralized until months later, and by then, Germany was already reeling. What endured instead was the bitter arithmetic: nearly 33,000 American casualties, and an equal toll on the German side, for ground that could scarcely be measured on a map. In hindsight, it stood as one of the U.S. Army's most costly miscalculations of the war. Yet the Hürtgen also carried a human legacy, one of resilience in the face of futility. Units shattered and rebuilt, soldiers pressed forward despite the mud, the mines, and the sense that no progress was being made. Comrades carried one another through a battlefield where medics often could not reach, and chaplains prayed over the wounded in holes scooped out of the earth. In that shared ordeal, bonds were forged that endured long after the guns fell silent. Today, the Hürtgen is quiet. Its trees have grown back, hiding the scars of battle, but memorials the landscape. In the village of Wassenach, in Kleinhall, and along the Call Trail, plaques and monuments mark where men fell. The American cemetery at nearby Henri-Chapelle holds thousands of crosses, each a reminder of a soldier who never left Europe. German cemeteries, too, hold their rows of dark stone markers, enemies once, now lying in the same soil. Visitors walking through the forest speak of its silence, broken only by the wind in the pines. For them, the Hürtgen is more than history. It is a reminder of the cost of decisions made far above the mud, paid for by ordinary soldiers whose names are now etched in stone. The legacy of the Hürtgen Forest is a paradox. It was a campaign that achieved little, yet it revealed much: the endurance of soldiers in impossible conditions, the tragic consequences of flawed strategy, and the haunting truth that not all victories bring glory. As one inscription at a memorial in the forest reads, "They gave their lives in a place that history nearly forgot." The chapter closes with a sobering reflection. In the great narrative of World War II, the Hürtgen may be overshadowed by D-Day, Market Garden, or the Bulge. But for those who were there, it was a defining crucible, A battle where the forest itself seemed an enemy, where courage was measured not in miles gained but in days survived. And it leaves us with a haunting truth. Sometimes the greatest tragedies of war are not found in victories or defeats, but in the battles fought at unimaginable cost, with little to show in return.